But moving on a little bit now, one thing that's happened in the last week or so, or around this time, is that I'm actually celebrating my 6-year anniversary of actually like going out and starting out podcasting and stuff like that. And I'll get into it a little later of how I kind of got into it and stuff like that. But it's hard to believe that it's already been 6 years. And I mentioned earlier in this podcast how on the Underachievers podcast page that I do with my good buddies, Brian and Jeff, we just celebrated on March 11th our 4-year podcast anniversary, where we started that back in March of 2020. So if you want to check that out, we had an anniversary podcast where we brought in 2 special guests, and we just kind of talked a little bit about some highlights and stuff that have kind of come out in those 4 years of podcasting and everything. And another thing we did was that a lot of that podcast was kind of talking about Star Wars, and we kind of got off track a little bit from that, but it is a good episode to listen to of that front, which maybe kind of want to talk about this, bring it up here too, because not only is it 4 years for that, it was March of 2018, pretty much spring break of my senior year of college, when my little brother, just this quick story about how I even got into doing these podcasts and everything. And I think I may have mentioned it early on, but maybe in like a test show back in those first few days of actually doing these podcasts. But back in like maybe late February, early March of 2018, I got a random text from my little brother saying that Mitch, that's the original title of the Mike and Mitch of Whitmer podcast, was originally the Mike and Mitch podcast, because originally that was the podcast we had together, because one of the things that we were going to set out to do, or what kind of Mitch kind of came up with during that time while I was at school, was to maybe do a podcast or something like that, in which we can kind of talk about sports and stuff like that for a half hour, an hour, however long it was going to be. And at the time, I don't think we really kind of said or whether it was going to be strictly hockey. I think early on we even did like talked about the Phillies early on too. So it was just one of those things we were going to talk about, maybe like local sports, and maybe we would talk about the Eagles here and there, or the Phillies and Flyers, but eventually it just ended up being us talking about the Flyers. And like most things, that one just kind of fell by the wayside. Mitch just kind of never really grasped too much to it. It was just something for him to kind of do in that time. So, and that first, there may have been like an episode or 2 that came out around this time, like 6 years ago, but a lot of those were some of those were test runs, but at the same time, the solo podcast, the MikeWitmer Podcast page, also came out then, because during that spring break, actually, was when we first tested out a couple episodes, talked about Flyers here and there. And then later that week, I believe, I brought Jeff on, a good buddy, and we talked a little bit about Flyers here and there as well, because, again, all 3 of us are all kind of big Flyers fans, so it was something that could be fun to kind of do and something different. So we set out to do that about 6 years ago. That we did that for that week. I went back to school shortly after that, and then that summer, I think Mitch and I may have did like a couple podcasts here and there, but for the most part, it was just Jeff and I meeting here and there whenever we kind of had a free time to just kind of get on, talk about hockey. And this first couple, maybe like first year or so, or maybe 2 years, we weren't really trying to branch it out into really anything. It was just something so we can kind of appreciate and talk more about the team we like in the Flyers, and talk about hockey, the sport we liked. So it was something that was just fun to do and everything. And it wasn't until like late 2019 or 2020 when we it was like late 2019, sorry. When we started to try to branch out a little bit more in terms of getting maybe more listeners, and actually branching out to hopefully bringing this podcasting, our pages out to a grander audience and everything. So that's around the time when we had a logo created for us and for that Whitmer podcast. And when we actually kind of put more emphasis on putting more stuff out on YouTube, we created the YouTube pages and everything. We were trying to do a little more make the podcast a little shorter, but find segments here and there that we felt were kind of interesting to kind of talk about, which is why we were able to kind of bring on Brian, which inevitably brought forth the Underachievers podcast. And in those first, obviously, few years up until 2020, all those podcasts were done in person. And the first 2 podcasts of the Underachievers was done in person. And it wasn't, and in that time between like June or summer of 2018, I would maybe get on here and there, do a solo podcast. But it wasn't until like 2020 when I did a couple more here and there. That's when I kind of talked more about like theme park kind of stuff, so I could actually kind of branch it off. That was kind of stuff I was kind of interested in, and everything that wasn't just sports related, because everything else podcast wise that I've done at that point were, even though Underachievers don't always go into sports, but that was a good kind of sports heavy at times podcast. Obviously, Whitmer Quick, we talk hockey, so I felt it was a good kind of way to talk about something different. So one of the first episodes that I did, which is on this channel as well, was talking about theme parks and everything. And at that time, I was talking about going down to Walt Disney World, because we had just done the 10K and the Run Disney in early 2020, right before everything got shut down and everything. And then I just kind of, again, one of those things, Underachievers and Whitmer Quake, kind of the reason why I have been a little spotty in terms of posting on this page is because those pages kind of took up most of the time, and obviously life itself kind of took over at times here and there too, because the way Jeff and I would do hockey podcasts before, we'd kind of fallen off a bit over the last year or so, which was, we kind of just texted one day. It's like, you want to talk hockey? Sure. And then we kind of got on and talked hockey and podcasted. Once we did Underachievers, it was a weekly thing. After like the second episode, I think we did like an episode, and 5 days later, we did an other episode that we figured out, okay, we kind of have to maybe make these weekly thing, because there wasn't too much happening in between one episode to the other episode that really made it worthwhile. But yeah, it was obviously a fun time. I still look forward to it. I still enjoy it. I honestly didn't even think going into my senior year of college that I would be doing podcasts and stuff like that. I still am using the same equipment and everything that I've used back when the podcast started, when I first started doing these podcasts and everything. The only thing that changed was this camera that I'm using to record this video on for the video purposes of this podcast. The microphone, which I said, the Tiki Sky review was also on that MikeWitmer Podcast YouTube page. I'll link it below, and everything too. That video, it is longer. Obviously, it's over a half hour long, so I get it if maybe people are a little more weary of not wanting to stick around too long to watch a half hour video or so. But that's a good one too. But it wasn't until like in 2022 when I started to branch out and do MikeWitmer Podcast pages more, and start doing these a little more often, and try to make a kind of concerted effort. That's where you see this. That's when kind of the room kind of changed into the space that I'm doing these podcasts in now, and that's how these podcast channels kind of come out since then, and I kind of look forward to it every week. That's just kind of a quick kind of went a little off tangent here and there, but that's for the most part how I kind of got into these podcasts and everything. I honestly think this is something I would love to do. If these pages could branch out and become something successful, then that would be, for me at this point, a dream. That would be awesome. But yeah, I always am looking to kind of branch out and try different new things and everything for this Mike Whitmer solo podcast and everything. The one thing I've definitely learned a lot in terms of since doing these solo podcasts and everything. And yeah, there may be a couple weeks here and there, and I definitely felt it when I've done a couple Underachievers here and there where the podcast may not have been the strongest. We may have stretched the topic too long and everything, or there may have been not too many great topics or anything like that. But it's those tough ones that make it a little harder, but I always look forward to it every day. It's always a fun kind of task. I've obviously, if one thing I feel like I've done better on is kind of speaking a little louder and everything. And yeah, I still have that tendency to still mumble here and there, but I feel like I've definitely gotten better at it since having these podcast pages and having these recordings and everything. It's definitely made it a lot, made me improve that kind of ability more too, besides just my ability to do audio or video editing or videography and everything. Since I started doing this vlog and everything, being able to actually hold a camera, because early on, and this is kind of why I went down the communications field and the way I went in terms of wanting to find a career in, is since I was a kid and like middle school ages, I've always found it enjoyable. I've always do it either with my little brother or neighbors, or even I think occasionally here and there with cousins, where I would just you'd shoot like the most random videos here and there, just to highlight it, almost like gold memories and everything like that. So those are always moments that stuck to me, and since then and everything, that's always been something I wanted to grasp on and do, and I'm glad that I have this platform to be able to do that on. So that's pretty much why I kind of still do what I am doing today. So that's just kind of my long spiel of saying it's been a fun 6 years of doing these podcasting.